I'm Brian Adkins. I'm I'm associate pastor at Epworth United Methodist Church and also Trinity United Methodist Church, which is on the south side of Berkeley. And I was just appointed to those two churches July 1st. Before that, I was in Richmond for 5 years at Open Door. Lovely congregation, small family-sized church, very progressive, very active, and very supportive of me while I was serving on the commission on the way forward. I spend a lot of time in rooms talking to people that I don't know without knowing what they know or what they want to hear from me. So I'm going to talk a little bit, and then if there are things you want to know from me or we need to go in a different direction, I'm flexible that way, okay? So I will start just to give you a little bit of background about myself. I have been under appointment for, 6 years, 7 years now. And I did not start out United Methodist. I was raised Apostolic Holiness Pentecostal in Ohio. And the Apostolic Holiness Pentecostals came from the Methodists back in the 19th century out of those revivals, mainly in South, and kind of left the Methodists behind 100 years ago. But they got a little too evangelical, a little too... John Wesley called charismatics enthusiastic. They got a little too enthusiastic for the Methodists, and so they kind of went their own way. But that's where I grew up. Small Pentecostal churches. My grandmother was a very strong, very centered, old Pentecostal woman, and she was a prophet and a peacemaker in my life. And for me, growing up, the church was the center of my world. It was the center of our community. Everyone I knew. It was, for me, worship services were my idea of what heaven would be like. Everyone I knew, literally everyone I knew in the world, was in a room together singing and celebrating and praising God. And that is the sort of environment that I grew up in. And it wasn't until later when I started to realize who I was more fully and come out as a gay man that I ran into problems theologically, but I never felt totally rejected by my faith community. In fact, I've often said that it was harder for me to come out as a Christian to my queer community than it was to come out as queer to my Christian community. And those of you who are part of the family will know what that means. It's still a struggle. But I think also one of the important things to know about me is that I was baptized in a place called Big Darby Creek in Muhlenberg Township, Ohio. One Sunday after church, my whole church congregation went down to the bank of the Big Darby Creek, and several of us were baptized. And I waded out into that water. I didn't have any shoes on. My dad was on one side and my pastor was on the other side. And we walked out there, and I felt my feet sink down into the mud of that riverbed. Felt that mud between my toes. And I went back, full immersion baptism, and came back up, and my friends and family on the bank all singing and praying and shouting. And one of the things I learned from that was that sometimes God has to take us back to the mud that we were created from to remind us of who we are. And second thing that came to me was that when I went to seminary many years later, I heard my classmates talking about their baptismal experiences. And they were all United Church of Christ, Presbyterians, many Methodists. But what they had in common was that they had been baptized either in these big baptismal fonts in churches or sprinkled, like some are done. But the common thread for them was that this clear, clean water. But the truth for me was that when I came out of that water, I was dirtier than when I went into it. And I think one thing that says about me is that I'm not afraid of muddy water. The water was muddy when I was baptized, and the water was muddy when I came out as a gay person, and the water was muddy when I answered my call to ministry. The water was muddy when I accepted the appointment to the commission on our way forward. And the waters have been very, very muddy all along. And since General Conference in February, even muddier, even more muddy, But I'm not afraid of muddy water, and I'm not afraid to disagree with somebody on the other side of the aisle from me. I think that we're in this together, and Christian community is messy. I was just preaching about that this morning. We're called to a really messy kind of community, but we have all of these examples of what it can be like. And through it all, Jesus constantly calls us to remain in love, whatever we do. So that's where I start. I was baptized in muddy water, and I found my way to the United Methodist Church, and I am a zealous convert. I found my true faith in Wesleyan theology. I moved here from Texas. I've been living in Texas and serving in the AmeriCorps, and I moved here about 15 years ago. And I remember thinking, finally, I'm in California. I will never have to deal with church people again. and the way God works sometimes, the first friend I made in San Francisco said, I want you to come to church with me. And I said, there is no way that I am going to church with you. And he said, but this one's different. And he took me to Glide. And it was Reverend Karen Olivedo's second Sunday as a pastor there. And I saw the church doing the gospel, living the gospel in a way that I did not know was possible. I came from people who were very faithful to the gospel and very faithful in community to one another. But I had never seen a church really reaching out in the depths the way that Glide does. And there's a complicated story happening in Glide now. And I have some thoughts and feelings about it. But what I really want to say is I support our bishop. I think Bishop Carcano has tremendous integrity. And she's deeply spiritual, and I think that she's confronting some things that have long been left unconfronted, let's say. But I had my start at Glide, and Reverend Karen Olivedo was a formative teacher for me. And seeing her go on to become a bishop and seeing the struggle that she's been through as the first openly gay bishop in the church has been both empowering and also disheartening. There were times when I was on the commission and Bishop Karen Olivedo was doing her ministry, and she and I would sort of call each other or text each other, and it felt sometimes like we were on islands across from each other, and we could see each other, but we were having different experiences, but we both were sort of isolated in a way. But we did try to support each other. Now, we went through a little bit of the history of the United Methodist Church, but I want to just mention the history before that. Back in 1844, the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, split over the issue of slavery. One of the Southern bishops had acquired, through marriage, a slave. And the General Conference that year suspended him until he would disavow slavery. And almost immediately following that General Conference, the Southern churches developed a plan of departure. And they seceded and started the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And these two churches that emerged from that went their separate ways. And some historians looking at this, at what happened, the Methodist split, and then the Presbyterian split, and then the Baptist split. All of them north and south. And historians looking back at that, a lot of them say, well, if the churches couldn't stay together, how could the nation? This was about 20 years before the Civil War. And it feels sometimes like we're in a similar moment now, doesn't it? So, these churches split. Well, the Methodist churches, the Methodist Church and the ME South Church, they both grew exponentially. They both expanded west, and some might say that they grew tremendously because they were able to true their own values. So what we had was a Methodist church building across the street from another Methodist church. And those churches both just really expanded. And sometime later, almost 100 years after the split, in 1939, there was an effort to reunify. And 2 years ago, the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry hosted a colloquy. Why do they use that word? Because nobody knows it. Some conference on bringing together our best thinkers, our best Methodist professors and theologians and historians, asking them to submit papers about what do you think about this way forward? How does it fit into the context of the history of the Methodist movement in the United States? And almost all of them agreed that reunification in 1939 was a bad idea and that it was poorly implemented. Because what happened in the conflict was that it forced us to really examine our values in a way that changed how we did church. And the idea that we needed to reunify took precedent over the values that we had uncovered for ourselves. And one of the things I said early on to the commission was that we have to be careful about what reunification, what unity looks like. The commission have been given these edicts, have been given charges to maximize the unity of the United Methodist Church to the extent that was possible, and to provide for contextualization for ministry. So for us to be able to minister to the people in our area where we are in the time we're there. And then also to maximize the witness of the United Methodist Church. None of those things are very clearly defined, but definitely we were starting with unity. And I have some concerns about that, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but with that starting place, and without really defining what unity was, we had a huge task ahead of us. And I was thinking back to the merger in 1939, and what you hear in the merger, there's no video recordings of that uniting conference, but there is an audio recording. And when they call for the vote, you hear those in favor, aye, those opposed, nay. The ayes are unanimous, and it makes it sound like this is a completely unanimous, everybody agreed. What a moment when everybody in the Methodist Church agreed on what the course of action was. But the reality is that the African American delegates to that conference were silent, because they knew that the reunification meant the establishment of a central jurisdiction, the codification of segregation. And that's what happened. We created a central jurisdiction. And if you don't know that history, research it, learn about it. This is a really important history for us to know. It's a shameful part of Methodist history in the United States. Well, what I said to the commission is that we need to be sure we understand the difference between the sound of unity and the sound of a people being silenced. So we come from this history, a shameful history, and sadly, as the commission began its work, one of the first things that was suggested was some rendition of a central jurisdiction, a segregated church for those who affirm LGBTQ people, which is not a great place to start, right? So here we are, our divisions now roughly along similar lines geographically to where we divided in 1844. The church outside the U.S. growing exponentially. The churches in the central conferences, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are growing very fast. And there's a lot of I don't know how to say, there's a lot of suggestion that it's the fault of the African churches. We're in this mess because the African churches won't affirm LGBT people. Well, I think that's really unfair, because first of all, it was white Americans, primarily Southerners, who took the message of Christianity and the message of Methodism to the African continent. And we handed them a system of beliefs and asked them to change their ways and their practices and their beliefs. And now, 150 years later, we come back and say, well, we have changed our minds on some of these things, so you should too. right? And I've heard stories from a lot of the African delegates who have said, you know, in the early days, missionaries would come and they would set up these churches, and they would go back every 4 years to a conference and represent us. So there were always white people representing the Africans at our general conferences, and suddenly at one point someone said, well, why are they going for us? Why don't we go for ourselves? And thank God, because we believe in representation. We believe in self-representation. And the United Methodist Church has always been a very democratic church. I fear now sometimes that we're losing a little bit of that. I feel a little bit that we're becoming a little more top-down than I'm comfortable with. But I guess what I want to put out there is that I want to be careful what aspersions we cast upon the Central Conference folks, to recognize the cultural setting that they're in, and to recognize their own autonomy. The movement to have the United States become its own Central Conference has not really gained steam. Some of the models that have come forward have been kicked back and forth, renamed many times, and have never passed. So I'll tell you that I sat on the commission with these 31 other people. We weren't really representatives. They tried to put together a diverse group of Methodists who would come together to talk about what the possibilities were for us. I was the only gay clergy person on the commission. There were two other gay people, two lay people, one from Chicago and one from North Florida. And broadly representative of the central conferences, each of the jurisdictions. And we worked together, again, trying to outline that unity, contextualization, and maximizing the witness. And in my opinion, looking back now, I think the fatal flaw of the commission is that we started with the idea of unity. How can we be unified? Rather than starting from the idea of mission. There's a quote from Antoine Saint-Exupéry that says, if you want the people to build a ship, don't drum them up to gather wood, but instead teach them to long for the vastness of the sea. And the commission definitely went about drumming up the people to gather wood. And instead of talking about what might be possible, and so many times I sat at the table and said, this is not a relevant conversation in my context. I was serving in Richmond, California, where a third of my congregation were homeless or marginally housed, where every single family in my congregation were touched by the disease of addiction, where people were struggling to find or stay employed. Mental health and other issues were happening in people's lives, and sexuality didn't come up hardly at all. It didn't come up a lot. And I kept saying to the commission, we're sitting here and the world doesn't know we're here. And it's also true that while I was on the commission, two of my family members died from heroin overdoses, and two young LGBT people in my family tried to commit suicide while I sat on that commission. So for me, it was a pressing issue. It didn't come up in my ministry context, but there were so many things happening in my personal life that touched on the work we were doing as a commission, but it often felt like a distraction. It often felt like we're putting all this time and energy and resources into this, and I couldn't help but think, what if the United Methodist Church spent $1 million in 2 years focusing on the heroin epidemic, or focusing on Black Lives Matter, focusing on mass shootings, focusing on one of the things that we might be able to affect. We've been talking about human sexuality for 40 years, more than 40 years. This is a conversation that's deeply ingrained in our society. More than sexuality, gender identity is just at the root of so much of our social norms. Homophobia is obviously rooted in misogyny. And one of the things that I wrote down while I was watching the slides was the insertion of the language of practice of homosexuality. For a lot of the conservative folks that I met, it wasn't about the identity of being queer, it was the practice of it. And that's a problem, and I want to tell you why. It's a problem because when I'm called to love my neighbor, but when I see my neighbor and I think immediately of their identity as a sin, when their identity is reduced to a sin, when my identity as a gay man is reduced to a sex act, I'm no longer your neighbor, right? And so queer people start from the deficit. We start from the place of having to establish our humanity, to establish our identity as a neighbor, so that we can be in conversation, so that we can be in relationship. And the hyper-focus on practice is problematic at best, but it's quite shocking, actually. The way I would hear some commission members talk about human sexuality came from places that an absolute ignorance of human sexuality in general, not homosexuality or any queerness of identity, but just the nature of human sexuality in general. It's something that we as a church fail to talk about. We fail to talk about sexuality, we fail to talk about mental health, we fail to talk about addictions, we fail to talk about things that are tough to talk about. We fail to get messy in healthy ways. We like to get messy in unhealthy ways, right? Conflict abounds. One of the things that I love about United Methodism, and I think that a lot of us don't recognize how unique it is, the Methodist connection, our connectionalism. If you talk to a Presbyterian or a UCC person or a Lutheran, in my experience, a lot of them are confused by this idea of connection. That the United Methodist Church in Brentwood is the United Methodist Church in Berkeley, is the United Methodist Church in Zimbabwe, is the United Methodist Church in Russia, is the United Methodist Church in the Philippines. We are the United Methodist Church. We're connected in this way. We have the itinerancy system, so that I'm the pastor in the United Methodist Church. I may be appointed to any United Methodist Church there is, as with your pastor here. And I have to tell you one story. I got a call a couple years ago. Well, I got an email. I woke up one morning, I had this email, I had come in at like 1 in the morning, and it was from a woman who established all her credentials. She said, I'm a Methodist, and I live in Tennessee, and my husband was a pastor in Kentucky, and this is the name of our bishop, and it went on and on. It read like one of those emails you get from a Nigerian prince who like establishes all their credentials. And then she went on to talk about her granddaughter who was missing, and she needed my help. And it was a very long email, and I just wrote back, please call me. And I gave my cell phone number, and she called me. And she was the wife of a retired United Methodist pastor. Her granddaughter was homeless and struggling with drug addiction. She was in an abusive relationship with a man, and they had last been seen in Richmond, California. And I went out to look for her granddaughter. And I looked for months for her granddaughter. When I was out places, I would ask if anyone had seen her, if they knew her name. When I would go around, when I was at the homeless shelter or the soup kitchen or the food pantry, I would ask about her. Have you seen Rhonda? Her name was Rhonda. I never found her. But I stayed in connection with her grandmother, the woman who had called me, Vida. Her name was Vida. And I would call Vida every now and then and just check in. Have you heard from her? What's the news? And Vida would tell me, she was in Southern California, or we heard that she's in another part of the state. And I just said to her, Vida, I'm going to keep looking for her. If she shows up in Richmond, I'm going to keep looking for her, but please tell her that wherever she ends up, if she can, get to a United Methodist church. Find a United Methodist pastor. Find a United Methodist church, because I know a United Methodist will help her. I mean, we should be able to say that of any church, right? We should be able to say that of any church, but I know our connection. And months went by, and I called Vida one last time, and she said she's in, and I can't remember if it was, I think it was Eureka. She said she's in Eureka, and she had gotten away from this abusive boyfriend, and she had met the pastor of the church, the United Methodist Church there, and that pastor bought her a Greyhound bus ticket to go home. And she got home, and her grandmother met her, and she got her into a recovery program. And I don't know what the end of that story is. I know that's the beginning of some new story, but that's the way our connection works. I mean, just last year, I got a call from a woman that I served on the commission with. She also is from Kentucky, and there was a pastor from their conference who was here visiting San Francisco with his family, and he had a heart attack. And they were going to be here for weeks, and she said, can you go visit him? And I said, I can, but I'd rather connect you with the pastor of the Methodist church closest to that hospital. And I connected her and that family with Sadie Stone at Bethany United Methodist Church in San Francisco, and she accompanied that family. And likewise, when I was pastoring at St. Luke's in Richmond, I had a family who were taking their daughter to Cincinnati Children's Hospital for a series of surgeries, and they didn't know anyone there. And I said, let me call the nearest Methodist church. And I called, and it happened to be the church where David Meredith was the pastor at the time. I don't know if you know David Meredith, but he's a gay pastor. He was in Columbus for a long time, but now in Cincinnati. And that church met them, and we prayed with them, and they brought them food, and they took care of them. And this is the power of the connection we have. And I'm afraid that we will lose that. I don't know what the new structure of the Methodist church will look like. I don't know about what is the right move forward for the church. But I do believe that if we lose that connection, we're going to lose a really important part of our identity. And even as the church shrinks, it's true that in American society, church in general is on the decline, and the United Methodist Church also is declining. We still have 32,000 congregations in the United States. That's twice as many as there are McDonald's. Okay? Think about that. Twice as many churches. So we're still... Bringing the money. Right. Or we should start drive-through windows. One of the things, as a progressive Christian, one of the things that concerns me as we have this dialogue about what's going to happen next in the United Methodist Church, I sat at General Conference, I listened to all the harmful language that came out there, and then I came back and went to our annual conference, and I saw how angry people have been and still are. And my big concern for us as progressive people is that we not lose our commitment to nonviolence. Because I think as soon as we lose that commitment to nonviolence in word, thought, and deed, we have lost track of the gospel. We've lost the moral high ground. And it's not to say that we don't continue the resistance and continue the struggle, but that we do it in the name and the way of Jesus, rather than in the way of, rather than in the reactionary way that we might go about it if coming out of our own emotions or coming from a place of our own pain. I was saying today to my congregation that in my experience, progressives tend to whitewash the gospel in a way that we don't want to talk about the sacrifice and the blood theology. And I get that because I have some problem with that, the gruesome theology. But I do think that we can't sidestep the cross on the way to God's justice. If we want to pursue social justice in a Christian way, we have to recognize that from a Christian perspective, God's justice is always shaped by the cross. It's always shaped by the cross, and we have to start there. So as we think about what's happening with the United Methodist Church, there are several groups that are meeting to talk about what's next. Adam Hamilton put a group together. There was a group with Dave Knuckles and RMN that met in Minneapolis in the spring. There have been other groups. Our Western jurisdiction has met. In some ways, I feel like we had a moment right after General Conference, and that moment kind of got watered down. as we, I don't know what was able to come out of that moment, but I know that we were in a time when people were ready to move in a particular way. And what I hear now as these meetings unfold is a push toward either reclaiming this denomination, this institution from those people. So it's an us versus them, continuation of the us versus them. Or there's a, we're going to start a new thing. We're going to start a new institution. It's still an us versus them, but it's an us leaving them because they're not going to work for us. But my concern is to hyper-focus on the institution, I think is really problematic. If we form a new institution, in an age when institutions are on the decline anyway, I think it's a waste of resources. John Wesley didn't set out to start a new church or start a new institution. John Wesley set out to start a movement. I think if there's a way forward for us, it has to be a movement. It can't be go set up a new denominational structure. That's going to take years and resources and time that we just don't have. People are literally dying while they wait to hear the good news. And we have the good news. And as progressive Methodists, we forget that Methodists are, by nature, an evangelical people. And I know in a place like California, the E word is almost like a swear word. I said, I kept using the E word, the evangelism, in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, and some woman came up to me and said, I'm going to tell Pastor Christian, the senior pastor, I'm going to tell the pastor that you were cussing at church. I was like, okay. What I see in the wake of all this is congregations recommitting themselves to doing the work where they are that they've been called to do. And I think that is the model of way forward. I've been calling, the phrase I've been using since General Conference is forward anyway. I'm a big fan of that quote that's attributed to Henry Ford that probably wasn't Henry Ford, that says, those who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those who are doing it. And I think those of us who are doing ministry in our context, reaching people in their need, should keep doing that and do more of it. And not be distracted by those over there who say we shouldn't do it or we can't do it or we're not allowed to do it. There was a big threat leading up to that General Conference. And for the entire time that we were working on the commission, there was this big threat that conservatives are going to leave and they're going to take their property and their money. And I kept thinking, well, my God, let them. Let them take their property and their buildings and let them take our property and our buildings too. Because it might be the best thing that ever happened to us. You know, get our butts out of our pews, get us out of these buildings that are draining all our resources with the plumbing that doesn't work and the electricity that's going to burn down the church and all the other things. Get us outside of these four walls and leave us with just street corners and open fields like we had before. And let's go out there and be among the people. It might be the best thing that ever happened to us, wouldn't it? It could be. I don't know. I mean, where would we have our potlucks like that? The thing is, we will always find a place to assemble ourselves. We will always find a way to sing together. That's just in our nature. It's who we are. It's the continuity of the church. One of the things that I have always told people at my congregations and I love about the church is the intergenerational community that we have. And I always have to like re-examine the math when I say this, but I'm going to say it to you now. In our congregations, the 8-year-olds in our congregation, we have 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds sitting on a pew together and singing. Where else in the world does that happen, right? Where else in society does that, where do people sing together anyway, but 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds? But the 80-year-olds in our congregations, when they were 8 years old, the 80-year-olds in their lives would have lived through the Civil War. We have this continuity of the church. One of the things that I've taken to doing my method nerd hobby has become doing ordination genealogies for new ordinands, tracing back their ordination to the bishop that laid hands on them, and the bishop that laid hands on them, and the bishop that laid hands on them, all the way back to John Wesley. And for most of it, it's between 6 and 8 generations between us and John Wesley. And I just love that continuity of the church. And the continuity of the church continues whatever the structure of the organization, whatever the structure of the institution. So I don't know if you hope that I would come here and tell you that you should follow Adam Hamilton's model or Armand's model or somebody else's, but for me, the only model that I can really get down with is the forward anyway. Moving forward, answering our callings in the way that we're called to do. Responding to the gospel as we have received it, preaching the truth as we know it, and reaching out to the margins. Day after day, it's what we're called to do. And if we stop doing that, then we might as well stop showing up on Sundays. You know, the church doesn't just exist for the hour that we worship together. The church is the body of Christ in the world. And the thing that I always ask in our prayers is that God remind us that we're your hands and feet at work in the world. And I always end my prayers with, in the name and the way of Jesus. And I said this at annual conference. We are called to pray in the name of Jesus. That's what we're called to do. Jesus told us, pray in my name. But a lot of harm has been done in the name of Jesus and continues to be done. But harm cannot be done in the way of Jesus. So we pray in the name and the way of Jesus. And that is also how I believe we're called to work, in both the name and the way. So I hope that is helpful to you. And if you have questions, I'm happy to take them now.